Hello and welcome to the first live episode of the Feeling Techish podcast with myself, Lee Crossley, and I think we should probably introduce each other or introduce ourselves, just because it's a brand new series of the podcast. We did the last series all behind closed doors. No one could actually comment or listen live or ask any Q&A, but there might be some new people listening and watching. So I'm Lee Crossley. I'm an engineer at heart. I try and avoid doing live things because they generally work out badly. And I'll hand over to Mr. Andy Lowry.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm a software engineer who has a little bit more than a passing interest in team leadership. I also am a semi-professional yak shaver.
Hard to follow that. But I'm Lauren Bevan. I'm an ex-clinician, data scientist, and I'm not a coder or a technologist, but I've got quite a big passion about how technology can make a difference to people in healthcare across the world. So that's me.
I don't think you can say you're not a technologist, Lauren. I'm not sure that's how it works.
Not compared to you two. I can do some cursory JavaScript and a bit in Python, but not to a standard I'm particularly proud of. Not yet, anyway. We'll get there.
It's all right. That's every engineer under the sun, never to a standard that they're actually happy with, me included.
Yeah. I've recruited front-end engineers with less qualifications than that.
So this episode, what we're going to be talking about is open source, and we had a quick discussion before we went live, and we decided that Lauren's going to lead it because neither myself or Andy can actually stay on track. So we're going to go through the good, the bad, the ugly, and the downright mustardy of open source. So with that, Lauren, I'll hand straight over to you.
Yeah, so the first thing we wanted to talk about a little bit is one of the common misconceptions around open source equaling free, and actually what that means for people and how that can sometimes put people off. So I guess, Lee and Andy, is that a fallacy that you've fallen into before, or know of some more stories around people who have?
I think you need to be aware of the licensing conditions. Some people don't know their MIT from their GPT to their ESE to their various other letters and acronyms. Not all of those are actually licenses, by the way. And it's important to kind of check to make sure that what you are using and where you've sourced it from means that you can use it in your software. If your software is commercial, you might not be able to use it, or you might have to open source your software yourself. It might carry through that license. And it is something that a lot of people overlook. They just kind of see something on GitHub or a site like that and see maybe a README and see maybe a license file. Don't think many people actually even click on the license file, and most of them are actually boilerplate anyway and wrong licenses associated with things. So I think it comes down to double checking and a bit of due diligence around what it is you want to use and is it actually free and what the repercussions of using it are.
Yeah, there are actual, I think, OSI, Open Source Initiative, they recognize licenses that do allow you to charge for commercial use and for any use of any particular use you want, and it still be technically open source. So yeah, definitely read the fine print on all licenses. And one of the often common problems with it is believing that it will always be the same license as well. You sometimes find that different versions have different license agreements, and it's important to keep in a bit of an eye when you press the update button on npm or something like that you might be pulling in something that you're not licensed to use anymore. I'm using that as a specific example because that actually happened to me the other week. I pressed the update on a package which was previously free for commercial use, and the new version turned out it wasn't, and it was actually purely by accident that we discovered that it wasn't free for commercial use. So we dropped lucky there because we almost did something we shouldn't have done. But yeah, it's worth checking. I think there are actual packages which will scan your things like your npm lock files and things like that for licenses, and will let you know if any of the licenses change and things like that. I've considered putting them in a CI pipeline in the past, so it would fail if the licenses changed and we didn't accept it. It seems like a good way of preventing yourself from doing something you're going to later regret.
Yeah, I guess your CI/CD pipelines is a good place, because if you've got vulnerability checking and other bits in there, it's a good place to make sure that you're deploying something which you should be deploying. I guess it doesn't happen with everything. I mean, NPM is pretty good at looking for scanning for vulnerabilities and looking at licenses and things, but other software that you might be even copying and pasting and using other package management systems, which are available for other languages that Lauren maybe can't write, are slightly different and different setups in the way that they're used.
And I think linked to that, I think it's one of the misconceptions again around it being kind of giving away the crown jewels to people. So particularly in public sector, it's one of those things that people who develop software are not necessarily that keen to make it open source, because I think there's a perception that it then becomes non-commercial, non-viable, or not safe. And I think there's some strongly held views, particularly in this group, particularly in me, around like public money for public code and things like that, and actually how that can be facilitated through mandation of open source on some of those things.
Talking about the crown jewels, if you think about the Crown Commercial Service and particularly sort of GDS, they actually specify that if you're creating a public service, then that source code should be open source and coded in the open from day one, unless you have a very good reason not to, which is a good standpoint. And if there was, a lot of money in that code, then maybe they wouldn't do that. But the fact is that people don't open source things because they want to make money from that particular component. It's generally because they want, help with it, or they want community input. So that's what open source probably means more than I'm opening up, my private chest of secrets and wonders. It's not really that at all. I've worked somewhere before where we haven't open source things and sort of tried to fight to open source things, and it was that sort of lack of misunderstanding that people aren't going to create another company just like this one because you've open sourced a couple of modules or core components that other people might help you with, contribute even back to, and that's free. Bug reporting, vulnerability checking, all the rest of that kind of stuff. So it is a shame when companies don't see the value in open sourcing the things themselves.
But going back to that GDS and public procurement thing, I don't think it's policed well enough. So I think it is standard in there, but actually finding all that repository around all those kind of public repositories is actually phenomenally difficult to do. So there's one thing about making it open source, but there's a second thing about, are you making it accessible? So the next person that comes along can build upon it and can understand actually what's there and make sure that doesn't get paid for twice, and that people are kind of encouraged to use what's already there. I think that's a big issue that I see quite a lot around. It might be open, but where is it?
It's ironic that actually, because one of the GDS assessment items, or multiple of them, are making sure that you're reusing components across government. GDS stands for Government Digital Services, by the way, if anyone doesn't know that acronym. So yeah, literally you get a GDS assessor for GDS projects that will come in and say, have you looked and evaluated other potential existing open source products or cross-government products that maybe another even department have written? But like you say, Lauren, that discoverability is very tricky. There isn't a very easy way to kind of go, right then, what is this government department doing about this? What's this government department doing about this? Interdepartment comms themselves are probably pretty limited.
And they are better for finished products, but again, it's very easy to see, and particularly in the past year when there's been so much rapid development, lots of people coming at the same problem in the same way, and because those pipelines of products that are being rapidly built are all being done separately in silos, then it reduces the impact that the open source can have on it, because everybody's trying to solve it in a slightly different way, and then you end up with potentially loads of open source things that might be slightly better or worse when you probably would have been better to combine them all into one.
There's a problem there that also happens in the commercial world, and even all other worlds as well when it comes to software, is there's a little bit of not built here syndrome comes in there. You have a lot of very similar packages solving very similar problems in not all in a very good way, and so there's certainly our favourites, npm and NuGet and all these package environments. If you go on there and have a look for things, you usually find about 7 solutions to any problem, and you spend a lot of time trying to work out which particular one of these 7 solutions you want to pick.
Yeah, so Andy, when you're looking at those, because I mean, I do it probably daily, looking around packages and looking on, let's say, GitHub. There are other alternatives. Let's say you're looking for a plugin for a particular thing, and you see, right, there's 7 different packages, all with very similar names, very similar repos. One's not been updated for 10 years, but actually doesn't have any issues. One's been updated, but very, very recently. Seems to have a lot of issues, must have a lot of users, but it was only started a month ago. How mature is that? There's a whole raft of reasons why you kind of look and say, should we pick this one over this one? And so what do you kind of do to make that decision?
So one of the things that I actually use the most is the number of forks and stars on the GitHub repo. That's like a really quick measure. If it's got 1 or 2 and it's something that's really common, then I generally just ignore that package. Other people have decided it's not worth looking at, so I'm going to go with them. It's a shortcut. It's a shortcut to getting a good answer, and it doesn't always work, but it's a good way. Then obviously looking for how frequency of commits. GitHub, and again, is very good at that. It gives you a good idea of how often people are contributing and committing to it. Look for builds. That's another one I do as well. If there's an actual build process going there, it's particularly again, GitHub, the green tick on the commits that tells you that it's passed a continuous integration build and it's passed some tests, then that gives me some confidence as a quality. Then start looking at licenses and issues and pending PRs and those kind of things. They're the best things I find. Although I have also seen projects that have got all of those things, and then I found a small bug and submitted a PR, and it's never heard from again.
Welcome, you're now managing and maintaining your own public fork.
yeah. I've done that on some of the lesser known, some things where there hasn't been much choice. That's happened to me a few times as well, where I've ended up maintaining my own fork because the original developer is just long gone.
I think that's one of the things that stops people using it in some of those critical public service stuff is around actually their maintainability. But I think there are quite a lot of benefits. We've obviously talked about some of the tricks and issues, but I guess when you're thinking about doing it, what do you think the key benefits are around why people would want to go open source, given there seems to be a bit of, too much negative press about what it is and misconceptions about what it is?
I guess it depends what you're looking for. So, open source software is huge. It's not, there's many categories within that. If you're looking for a component or a module for a system that's quite small and discrete, you probably want a best in breed open source project that's tried and tested, deployed by hundreds of companies, large organizations, and maintained with them, or contributions coming from them, rather than writing your own and rolling your own. I don't know what you think, Andy.
Yeah, that slightly lost the question there, but I think that does happen. The problem we often have, though, is that sorry, I've lost the question. But one of the issues I have is that I've myself taken on a project and got very excited about it because it's very usable at the time, and then I've changed companies, or I'm not using that particular thing, and it's very easy for them to forget them. So one of the advantages is that somebody else can take that on if need be. So whereas for commercial software, closed source in particular, if that company goes, you've lost it. You've lost the product forever. Whereas with open source, at least there's somebody there who can potentially take it over and continue. It's just it's kind of another form of security. You lose the security that you get from paying somebody to do the work, but you gain that extra security that it's not just going to disappear off the planet all of a sudden one day.
You kind of always have that option, though, to kind of pay someone to do it. I mean, I see open source as maybe if it doesn't get you the whole way there and it isn't a complete off-the-shelf product, it could be that there is, a huge amount of legwork, let's say like a crypto library or something, that, I'm all right maintaining that or paying somebody to maintain that. If you look at the NHS, for example, they worked with a technology at NHS Digital called REAC by a company called Basho. Unfortunately, they went under, but NHS Digital created their own fork of it and went on to, for a long time, whilst it still even do, maintain that fork. So they wouldn't have written that sort of database technology themselves from day one, but it was a very good option at the time for them to basically back it and then continue to help develop it. So, there's always advantages to it. It always depends what the open source projects and component is. And I don't really want to say this on a live feed, but I'm a terrible person. And I do have a number of open source projects with the best of intentions that, was started like 7-8 years ago, probably about 150 of them. Sorry to anybody who's watching me on Twitter. Yeah, I will respond to these 200 unread messages on GitHub at some point. So, I mean, the best of intentions set out, I now think that, I'm leaving them up. I'm not even marking them as archives because they are still useful projects. And what I would love to see is somebody pick those up and run with them. So generally what I've been doing is if anybody does a pull request that looks semi-sensible and I need to get through that list of pull requests, I just make them a maintainer or a contributor, a maintainer straight away so that they can, run with it and publish it and approve other people's PRs and build up that sort of community around it so that it's not reliant on just one person. Because as someone's rightly said on the chat, you can't expect things to be maintained forever. Other people move on to new projects and they have to kind of leave some things behind. And that's just kind of the way of the world. It happens within organizations and non-open source stuff as well, right?
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of examples as well where it's gone the other way than the NHSD one with REAC, where commercial organisations have sunsetted it into open source and left it for others to kind of to build it out. So they've kind of say it's gone the reverse of that. But yeah, I agree around the maintainability, but it makes it somewhat less predictable to understand how quickly things are going to get fixed, which I think is one of the things that makes people slightly nervous about using it.
The getting fixed aspect, I mean, sometimes open source projects will have a sort of premium or a commercial offering that complements it, that has an SLA or bug fixes and things wrapped around it. Huge open source projects do generally attract that over time, because they want to make money. And I've been places before where that has been part of the selection criteria. So they've sat down and said, is there a commercial offering? Can we bring in an SLA? Can we do something to sort of mitigate some of the risks of taking this product? And sometimes, using the open source product gets you to a point, and then there might be a commercial product that you'd want to switch it out with because it's so great and there's loads of new features in the commercial one. You've taken that carrot and you really want it. So yeah, I think to kind of summarize that point is open source, there might be a commercial alternative which is better, viable, or meets your SLAs for your product or customer.
Yeah, a particularly good example that I've found of a sort of open source with paid support was Elasticsearch, Elastic. But I bring that up particularly because they've got extremely controversial this year. I don't know if anyone's been following the story with Elastic. Basically, I'll try and do the short version of the story. They built this system called Elasticsearch about 11 years ago, which was open source. There was a company built around it that mainly did support and services around it. At some point, they decided to produce a managed version of that service. So you basically, rather than having to host and running it yourself, you paid Elastic. Actually, I think a third party did this actually first, and then they bought that company, to be fair. But you pay them to host it, and you run it, and you just connect to it using HTTP, and you just say how many nodes you want and how much you're willing to pay for and things like that. And this system was reasonably successful. And then AWS decided to take Elasticsearch open source and do the same thing with it. So they've built basically a competing system that is based off this open source software. However, AWS have chosen not to be nice and contribute back, or also they've not chosen to be nice and work with Elastic to sort of compensate them in some way for the work that they've done. This obviously has become a real issue for Elastic, who with some, I think they probably, nobody's really broken any rules here. AWS have kind of done the right thing, but they've done something they're at least allowed to do. It's just a little bit outside the spirit of open source.
Spirit is not in the spirit of open source. That's the word.
No, but the Elastic are getting a lot of stick now because in their most recent version they've changed the license agreement. So now the license is not an OSI license; it's their own license that basically says you cannot use it for build your own managed service. Unless you contribute all of your managed service functionality back to the original product.
All right, all the managed service functionality, not just the sort of core products, right? Okay, so it's all the derived work.
Oh yeah. So they've really taken quite a big leap here, and I have a bit of sympathy for both sides here. AWS have not really done anything wrong, but also they're pretty much killing Elastic's business model. And there's a little bit of, are you just starving the golden goose here? They've got these people who are making this extremely good product, to be fair, and basically they're just making sure they're not getting paid for it. Then of course, but everyone's backlashing against Elastic at the moment because their license is no longer open source anymore.
It went to the other extreme. They should have got the right license in the first place rather than going too extreme because they've been burnt. I don't think Amazon have done anything wrong, and also I think that's a good model for organizations moving forwards. If you've got an open source project and you need that guarantees, that SLA, you don't want to be managing the tin it sits on if it is that kind of web service or something. Having a managed service wrap from one of the big cloud providers or multiple big cloud providers is good, because then you can go, right, okay, so we've got an Elastic compatible service or app, whatever it might be, and we can pay one of the big providers, and not just one, they don't have the monopoly to use that open source technology. And if I want to switch in the future, there might be a little bit of work, but we're not completely changing database tech or whatever it might be. I mean, Elastic is expensive anyway, so I think that's possibly one of the problems with Elastic, not just the rest of it. But Elastic have their own managed service offering as well. They're just not Amazon. So
their own managed Elastic product also works within AWS, and it can be paid for through AWS Marketplace. They also have a GCP and a Alibaba and a few other cloud provider versions as well. But they all have nice agreements with Elastic for reciprocal contributions and some payments, presumably. It's only AWS who have chosen to really bite the hand that feeds them. That's the phrase I was looking for earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Security on Ali Cloud. You want to see that in the open.
Talking of security on it, that's another thing, because there's something about how people use open source, not just for sort of commercial endeavors, but around whether or not it leaves you open to vulnerabilities, which I think is another, again, misconception, particularly in government services, around, how do we do our diligence on this to make sure that this is kind of safe and secure, and that we're not leaving ourselves open because you've got so many contributors? How can this possibly be safe? I think there's a kind of mental model issue with it that goes along. So I know that there was, so we were talking about it the other day, the BA scandal around how that worked, and that was kind of linked into the open source model. But I guess, what do we think in terms of how you're able to test the sort of contributor access if you want everyone to do it? How can you police the intent of people?
So the BA story, that's a great one. I use it as an example all the time, probably wrongly because I keep sort of skewing it to fit the exact purpose and point I'm trying to make. But it was, a contributor that managed to get some malicious code on a sort of dependency of a main package, which was included on the BA payment page. And the BA payment page, there's lots of packages on there. They try to limit the amount of sort of open source or third-party contributions or scripts, etc., that run on things like payment pages for good reason, because you want that as tight and limited as possible. In my view, checkout pages should be very, very small. People typing in credit card details, or just pay somebody like Stripe that's very good at it to give you a little iframe, and then you don't need to worry about it. But generally speaking, if it's not, a payment page or something, you're pulling in something, don't try and police the actual contributors to the open source package. No, nobody's got time for that. So effectively, you need to look at the versions that you're pulling in as part of your pipelines, like Andy was mentioning before, is make sure that you're doing the proper vulnerability testing and also, proper sort of security fuzz testing. So it could be that you're doing spinning up, fake browsers, fake devices, making sure that it's not sending network traffic out that it shouldn't be. Like in the case of BA, where it was sending key presses of credit card numbers back to a third-party server, like you can capture that kind of stuff. That's a known pattern. It's basically building up lots and lots of patterns of, things that could be malicious over time and checking for them before a release and fixing your versions. Don't just go, oh, let's upgrade the version of that all the time, because like you say, you can't police and check and test all of that. If you've got the most brilliant CI continuous integration pipeline in the world, it's probably not going to catch everything all the time, and 0-day vulnerabilities and CVEs. So basically test the thing, automate as much of it as you can, and fix your versions is the best way to kind of deal with that.
And there's a lot of good advice, and I think it's kind of bringing us on to obviously my pet love of NHS and open source around, I guess one of the issues that it's struggled with, not just around that kind of GDSy type stuff, is around like EPR vendors and the use of EPR vendors, because there's a couple of big juggernauts and they're not very keen on sharing at all. And it's quite a closed system, and lots of people suffer as a result of it. Like they get paid an awful lot of money for something, which then is basically a closed box to not integrate with anything else. And I'm pretty sure that even APIs or open source would be a good first step around forcing some of those, pricing some of those lock boxes open. But the organisations, I think, are patchwork. Well, they are patchwork and they're a jigsaw, but I just don't think that they push vendors hard enough to make that part of the offer. So when they're going out to procure stuff, it's not something that people look for. It's functionality first and foremost for reasonable reasons, but it just doesn't seem to be contracted for. And I'm always like baffled about why it's not in commercial clauses when it really should be.
And then you got to wait another 5 years or 10 years or however long before you can procure it again.
Yeah, and I just don't know. I just think, again, going back to those kind of fallacies around open source, you can still make money from it. You can still have a commercially viable business, but it forces you to work in a way that doesn't seem to be very conducive to the way that those software vendors into the NHS want to act. And I guess I just don't understand why, if you're building software for clinical purposes, why, surely there's some altruism in there because you've chosen that as your calling and that's what you've chosen to do. I don't quite understand the method then behind keeping people into like 10 or 15 year deals and making sure that it's really hard for them to operate outside of your kind of product ecosystems. You're not Apple. I guess it's my rant. I don't understand it.
I think it's going to change that. I think that unfortunately, because of this slow moving public sector and NHS when it comes to digital services, the steps are in the right direction. There's key people making all the right noises. It's a case of you've got these huge, let's say, organizations that have integrated with core NHS services for a very long time. And they want that monopoly. They want everybody to have to integrate with them. They want to be that intermediary and continually take that cash. What needs to happen is it's on the NHS to not force, contracts on those big players. It's for the NHS to actually sit down and say, right, okay, we've got a new way of operating. We've got, these shiny graph APIs and, easily accessible services that sit over here. We still have all the old stuff, and you can still go via the big guys that do all of this stuff. But we've also got this parallel system and parallel services that we've been designing and helping build, which is all open sourced. If you want to integrate with these and use some of our, components and SDKs for them, knock yourselves out. Let's go for it. And if you want to open source them as well, even better. We're more likely to pick you for help and procurement and things in the future. And then what will happen is the big guys hopefully go, hang on, we need to do something with those funky new little services over there, because everybody's starting to migrate over onto these things.
Yeah, I hope so. I just think it's not well enough understood how things could be, because I think people are so used to the kind of inertia with it. So I think it's around someone needs to take a punt to show how it can be done properly and how it can be done well, to be able to prove that it can be done safely and securely, and you don't need to compromise on it. And just because you don't have, you're not a £1 billion American conglomerate, you can still do some pretty awesome sort of clinical software development. And I think there are some smaller companies out there, but I used to be a deputy director of finance in the NHS, and I wouldn't have been looking for those sorts of things when I was buying stuff when I was back in service 12 years ago. So I kind of admit culpability, which is part of the reason why I'm probably so passionate about it, because I probably missed it when I was signing those contracts a while ago. And I do think there needs to be some sanctions in there, because there'll be plenty of people who are signing those orders off who are just like me 12 years ago, and they need to be given a bit of guidance about what to look for and how to do the diligence on it. Because open source just sounds a bit scary. Sounds like any muggins can kind of add into it, screw it up, and if you're dealing with critical information, you just don't. It feels too risky. Whereas,
how's any different to closed source, Lauren? I mean, I know some people.
That's exactly it, right? That's exactly it. It's not. It's not a massive change, but for some reason, because you've got someone you can point at and say, system failed this morning, no one's been able to do kind of clinical notes, we can't do any order comms or whatever it is, you've got someone you can point at. And I think that is something that the NHS, I think, really, really values, but over and above making something that other people can build on and can be interoperable and functional. It's just been made illegal, I think, this week in the US for things not to be interoperable. So I don't know whether or not we kind of have to wait our turn for the US to implement through policy changes stuff that we will then be the beneficiaries for, because we're tiny compared to that market. They're not going to respond to our market forces. They'll respond to somebody else's, which is depressing, I think.
I've not seen too much of that, but I can't wait to see how that's enforced.
I know, but it's causing issues. And it's one of those things, say Estonia have got it licked, and then there's a few other kind of companies out there who are doing it and are kind of doing it and selling that as their point of difference. And I think if they start to get a bit of a stronger foothold, then maybe that will change. But I'm not sure up until that point people will have the desire to want to do it, because it does feel risky. And I don't know how we educate people in that it's not as, it's not as awful as it sounds. It's not free for all. It's but I do think it's what we were talking before about, that predictability of support. How do you get SLAs in place? How do you de-risk it? I think are key things to making people feel like it's a bit more of a viable option for them to run a secure service on it.
It's the people making the decisions as well, educating them, because it's not the engineers generally that are helping build the services or use the components that are involved in those decisions. It's people that are less known to be involved in engineering, and those technologists that aren't technologists, Lauren, that are effectively making the decisions based on prior art. So they'll just copy the same kind of procurement, same kind of rules that happened last time, because nothing went wrong apparently, but things could be a lot better. But there's no visibility of that, or helping those decisions.
Yeah, and I think it is that thing of an EPR procurement seems to be something that once in a career thing for somebody in the NHS. So it's not as if you can really build up much tacit knowledge within the organisation about how to do it and how to do it well. So there is something about information sharing that goes on around, how do you do this? How do you sort of sort it all out? And the NHS is not very good at learning from failure, because you kind of have to put your big hand up and say, do you know what, I screwed this up. And I found that a lot easier since I've not been in the family, to be like, oh, I didn't do a great job of that. But yeah, I think there has to be somebody taking accountability for doing the education.
That's why your tech spikes. So just going back to that accountability and failing, why can't you fail in healthcare? I mean, fail before you move to production. So, smart teams building technical spikes over very short periods of time to prove out concepts, use open source systems, and basically say, does this thing work? Yes or no? That, it could be a failure, but you could have learned a lot during that time. It doesn't need to be a production system that you're going straight to, that is a big bang 5-year release that we're kind of used to.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that there's this issue internally to the NHS, because it's bound to agenda for change, which is essentially the pay scale. It's really hard to be able to recruit people in to be able to de-risk it. So there is a culture of outsourcing on all of these things, because people, again, if you're a software developer, is the NHS on your big list of people that you want to work for, or is it Google, or whatever, depending on how old you are. So I think there is a lack of talent in being able to support this and being able to give the option to people to say, if it does fail, we can do something about it, and we can use open source properly, because if it does screw up, we can spot it and we can amend it and we can fix it. I think it is generally a culture of outsourcing for that reason.
And this is where consultancies, they do have bad rep every now and again, and some of them are bad, but using consultancies and bringing in their experience as partners, and working with them to do particular jobs and saying, okay, we've used these packages before in these large banks, these financial institutions are using it, having that knowledge and understanding of some open source packages, as long as it's a sort of blended team with, for example, NHS Digital, to make sure that they understand exactly what they're doing, what the process is, and bringing those tools in and those skills in-house. Don't necessarily need everyone at NHS Digital to have worked on a million systems in a million different sectors. There are times when you can bring in that sort of expertise. And yes, I do work for a small consultancy, just put that out there.
Yeah. But what I do think it's about knowledge transfer, but it's someone to have it to transfer over to. A lot of the NHS organisations I've worked at just don't have massive technical teams. So it's that whole thing around who has it, like who do you give the ball to, who you're able to sort of coach and mentor to make sure that they're making the right decisions, which is why I think these decisions are made that are absolutely mad, because A, people don't understand that there's an alternative, and B, either they don't have enough faith in their internal teams, or their teams aren't kind of big enough or aren't punchy enough to be able to stand up and say, we really want to do this, we'd actually find this really interesting, and it would help some with some staff retention, because we'd be giving them some cool, interesting stuff to work on, rather than just being essentially a glorified asset replacement schedule house, which obviously not all NHS IT teams are, but some of them are. If you don't have a leader who's got a bit of vision and who kind of knows what's what.
Oh, here's SharePoint. You'll barely need to touch it. It does everything out of the box.
No, I could absolutely shudder on that.
Did you swear, Lauren? Was that a swear?
I almost swore down my jumper.
You said SharePoint. That's a swear word.
The S word. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, thinking you can run it all on Excel.
Depends how many rows you have, but yeah.
Oh, I just get like clammy thinking about that. But I think just thinking about, I guess, where the future is and what we think we can possibly, what could we do? I think there is something about education and de-risking of it all, and just feeling how people can, get some credibility and just feel like it's not, let's say that kind of random free-for-all where somebody just opens the door and just says, oh, just take what you like, that it's a little bit more regulated and a bit more controlled than that.
Unfortunately, it requires that sort of senior tech leader within healthcare to actually say, you know what, I have faith in this particular way of doing things. I want to run this project in this way and sort of, stick their neck out and do it. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. We are moving into a world where a lot of people now are technologists because younger generations moving through and are starting to eke into those more senior positions. So my kind of hope for healthcare in the future is we'll have people maybe even with, software engineering backgrounds that are in senior technology positions within the NHS that are able to make, some of these decisions.
We've talked about this before, and it's we've seen it happen a lot in other industries already. I'm wondering why healthcare seems to be a little bit behind on this.
Well, would you move to a position in, let's say, a healthcare provider now, Andy?
Depends what the job was, but probably not.
Yeah, I mean, it does depend what the job is, but I mean, it's not the first place you'd go out and look for a role, is it? You wouldn't think, oh, I wonder what, NHS Trust X or NHS Digital or NICE are hiring for at the moment. That's just kind of not the way that it's kind of set up at the moment. So that it is taking longer to filter into the public sector and particularly healthcare.
Yeah, and in lots of tech roles or senior tech roles like director of IT or CIO may not even be a board voting position. So it's hard to feel like you're able to have an impact if the structure of the organisation doesn't recognise your talent. It's starting to change, but I think it'll be a while before that's a board position or a board voting position so that those voices are in there. And I'm not sure, and I could very well be wrong, I frequently am, but I'm not aware of any chief executive in an NHS organisation who has got a technology background. They tend to be clinical or financial, which is not, or a chief operating officer, but they tend to come from that kind of triangle, and therefore will prioritise those things because that's what the regulatory regime has been, and that's what people get fired for screwing up on. It's overspends, CQC ratings, or A&E 4-hour targets, for an example. And I just think that nobody was ever fired for buying a crap EPR system, even though it's the second biggest capital spend after building a new hospital, but it doesn't seem to be a sackable offence. It's a really weird set of priorities around. You can screw something up that has 15 years worth of pain for like everybody in your organisation. It just doesn't.
Because you didn't change anything, Lauren, that's it. You just carried on with the same old. No one gets fired for, doing the same thing again. I mean, I would fire them, but
I would fire myself as well if everyone was like, do you know what, you put this new system in, it's shit and we don't understand what we have to do, and it takes 15 clicks to get through so we can input basic patient information. I would just take myself out of the building.
I'll do it for you. It's all right. We'll can make a pact now.
Yeah, that's fine. It's official. But I think that there are ways of, there are things that change, but I think someone's going to have to really take a risk on it, and publicise that they've made that risk and publicise that it's gone okay. So there'll be a lot of eyes and a lot of weight on a small number of projects around people who really want to kind of back it. I think it's just really difficult, I think, to see how it will get better. But I do think there has to be somebody who will champion it and who will be taken seriously.
You can tell that you're leading, Lauren, because that was a long chat about the NHS.
I'm sorry. No, I say I'm not sorry. It's important.
No, we're sorry. No, we're sorry.
It's important for all of us, but I do think, there's a lot to be said around how that can be made better and how it can make general public services, better and more responsive to people, and building on what's out there. It just seems to be a lot of vanity projects all across government, which somebody has to be responsible for, and put their name above it and talk about how they delivered X and how they did it all on their own. But yeah, I
think unfortunately the success stories don't get as much traction and press as the sort of horror stories. So and they're often skewed as well. The one that I kind of remember is when Airbnb, who are a big open source contributor, they used to use React Native for their mobile apps, and they did a big blog post, one of their engineers saying, I think it was a 4-part post saying how they're sunsetting it and moving away from it. What people don't realize is, that is effectively a product, an open source product written by Facebook. So it's like, oh, but Airbnb aren't using it. Oh, we're not going to use it anymore. We were worried about it. It's like, there needs to be a little bit of due diligence and understanding around things, and not just read all of the news that's skewed because it's interesting and the success stories kind of filter out to the bottom. It's like in the NHS, no one died and everything just worked, is not really a let's praise everything. It's the never events and things that happen.
Yeah, I do think it's that, but I also think that there is something where marketing get hold of it and it just becomes like quite fluffy, and it just becomes a little bit insincere. So you read these kind of paid for contributions and some of the stuff, and you just kind of read it and you're like, that was clearly written by a PR department. And I think it just comes across as somehow less useful, because it's like, you're like, yeah, I bet it didn't happen like that. I bet there were some problems, rather than this kind of perfectly veneered situation, which is on those press releases. Maybe it's like my British cynicism that comes through on that, but I always read that and go, yeah, but I bet there were some problems on release that you're just not admitting to.
Yeah, it's one thing that's definitely a bonus with open source is you're not paying for a marketing team or a sales team, or all the whining of dining that you get with certain tech companies who have considerably larger big entertainment budgets than tech budgets.
Yeah, true. I guess I'm always, like I say, my cynicism radar is always kind of triggered by some of those things where you just go, okay, righto. But yeah, I agree that the it just worked doesn't seem to be a particularly gripping story, and doesn't kind of grab the headlines. But yeah, that's for another time, I think. I think we've got quite a lot of comments and kind of questions and stuff in the chat. So just thinking, I'd encourage people to get more in thoughts, feelings, and comments. But yeah, should we start to go through some of those as well?
What would be really great is if people actually wrote them in question format right now, so that I can click on them. I mean, there's quite a lot of very good comments and a lot of stuff that I agree with. I could add additional comments to, but if there's any kind of particular questions,
there's a very good question.
Here we go.
Best?
Yeah, that's the best question that I've selected as the first one. Andy, do you want to take that one?
Is it one of mine or one of yours?
No, I think it's yours from about, was it 15 years ago on SourceForge?
Oh, right. Yeah, some Windows shell extension that allows you to encrypt a file just by right-clicking on it and saying encrypt and putting a password in. That I wrote 20 odd years ago. That it's still apparently on SourceForge, and someone even downloaded it recently.
That was me, because I wanted to take
it. No idea why they did that. Very certain it doesn't even build anymore.
It's all right. I'll give you a pull request. What version of Windows was it? 98.
Yeah, it will have been. Yeah, they're probably about right. Yeah.
Best open source project is kind of hard because it depends what sector is and what you're using. I mean, for me, it's crypto libraries. Unfortunately, you kind of want some of that stuff to be well tested and well trodden. There are some that you don't really like OpenSSL. That is definitely not the best sort of open source project, but it is a bit of a nightmare. But I wouldn't want to write it myself. Someone says it's Git, so Git itself is the best open source project.
It's quite a meta. It is quite a meta answer, but yeah, I agree.
It is open source, Git. I'm not a huge fan of Git. I would prefer Mercurial myself, but
SVN. Let's go back to that. It's so easy to branch and forth. We've got a question from Simon. What do you think about internal open source in large government organisations to encourage reuse? Well, why is it internal? Why does it have to be internal? Is that just for discoverability? Because I mean, it could be in the open as long as you've got a way of making sure that other people within the large organisations or cross government have a way of discovering those services. I mean, I've been in a meeting before where someone said, well, if we get MuleSoft in, it's like, whoa. And that was almost the answer to discoverability, which I still can't quite wrap my head around. I think there are better ways of making sure that people understand exactly what is developed internally. But you do have that not invented here, even within teams, within large government departments, and it doesn't work the way they want it to. And you end up with that XKCD. There's now 100 different components that do exactly the same thing.
But I do think that when you've got smaller people who want to innovate, so for example, if you look at some doctors and trusts who've got some really good ideas, if they could find more stuff in open source, I think they could probably make some of those things better and would almost like, use a developed software, more likely, and then more likely to be used and tailored. I also say that internationally, there's a couple of really interesting stuff that international governments have done, which I think probably people should be looking at as well as our own, because very few problems are new or unique to one country or sector or organization. Someone somewhere has probably fixed it. It's just a question of finding out where and how good it is and whether or not you back yourself. You reckon you could do better?
Well, people need to stop reinventing the wheel or thinking they're special. I mean, designers that think they're special and design something in a way that is completely unique is probably not the best way of doing it for their particular service, because it's something that other people are not used to using. Do not create a brand new interaction method. Yes, even if it's absolutely fantastic, the user will not be used to that particular way of interacting. Apple have had handsets in people's hands for a very long time. There's a lot of standard controls and components that you probably want to stick with now and not reinvent that wheel.
Yeah, we're fairly well versed in how hands and eyes work. We should probably use some of that science to base how the interactions with the software work.
Yeah, and also with that, if in doubt, go with what the big companies are doing with those sort of things. The big tech companies are doing with those kind of things nowadays, because they've put the research in, they've worked it out. There's no point us redoing it, especially if that's not where where the company you work for makes their money. Not. I mean, few companies are Apple or Google.
If it's in interaction design and that is your company and you're literally coming up with new innovative ways of interacting, then maybe, you've got some eye tracking software or something to do it. Fair enough. If you are a small government department and you're spending too much time figuring out whether the menu should go at the bottom, be a fly out or across the top. I mean, I remember 10 years ago sitting down and building a menu bar across the top and going, well, Google have just introduced it. They probably did some research on that. Let's just have a menu bar across the top.
Yes.
So, right. Well, what other questions have we got?
Lucy on IPR and open source before that one as well.
We'll go back to that one then. Open source or open standards. So open standards, particularly sort of open data standards, I'm 100% advocate of. Because it's hard work to define a data model. If you've got a known area like healthcare or travel or whatever it might be, having that data model or even protocol, whatever it might be, open as an open standard means you've got increased interoperability and you're not having to, like we said before, reinvent the wheel all the way from the ground up. Someone else is doing that hard work, and you can open source that open standard as well and allow contributions back. What a novel concept.
Yeah, and I think on the open standards, I say 100%, there's loads of stuff which is mad that there aren't open standards for. So medication dosing being one of them is absolutely mad that in primary care and in secondary care, they are done on different ways. So it's really hard for you to get your dosage from one care setting to the other, which I think is bizarre and obviously creates lots of clinical safety issues, because is it a microgram, is it a milligram, who knows? Not great. So I think open standards in parallel with open source, but if I had to pick one, at least you can measure someone against open standards, and it's not even reinventing the wheel, it's like guessing, is there a wheel, what is it, that open standards would help you with.
And good quality open standards as well. Your comment there about milligrams and micrograms reminded me of almost exactly that. An issue I had once when I used it was sort of an internal open standard. So it was kind of a standard that was used inside the organization. We didn't have units on a particular flow rate, the reading from a machine, and one machine would give in milliliters per minute, and one was in microliters per minute. And when I asked how do I know which one it is, I was told, oh well, the bigger machines just give you bigger numbers.
Yeah, Andy.
What?
So is that like open standards being used incorrectly almost? Because I've seen that a lot. Or people trying to morph what they've got into an open standard, and sadly, when that happens, it kind of ruins it for everybody. So, for example, FHIR, very, very huge. That's FHIR. Is a huge standard that designs everything except for pretty much security. Just kind of hand waves that and says, oh, that's an implementation application issue. But it implements everything else, and has a very comprehensive data model. What you can often find is when you've got such a big standard, people say, right, we're going to pick that standard, we're going to run with it and use it, and then they'll try and shove whatever they want that they've got into that thing because they're using it for something else, and actually they're kind of misusing what it was designed for just to kind of use it for everything. So it is about selecting the right open standard as well, or open standards. It might not just be one.
They can go the other way as well. You can end up with standards that are give you some sort of guidelines, and then they will then allow you to extend them if necessary. I know one that I'm sure Ryan's thinking about in the comments at the moment. Zigbee has some interesting. It's not bad standard. It just has some interesting things. Like if you decide if you're a particular type of widget that fits the well-known widget standard, but you've decided you want to add just a little new feature to that widget, you have to create a completely new type of thing, which then makes it totally incompatible with everything else that knows how to talk to widgets. That's an example of not a bad standard that because it's extendable in a not helpful way, it's not going to encourage reuse. In fact, it's probably going to discourage it, because then what happens is people say, why don't you just use Zigbee? You can do that, and then you end up with a whole bunch of things that are not compatible with each other, but they're using Zigbee.
Yeah. Well, which version of Zigbee, or which profile of Zigbee? And that becomes the issue. So like FHIR, for example, has custom profiles that you can put on top of things. But when we were chatting before about the sort of managed service wrap, if you've got a FHIR-based service, you might not support custom profiles or things like that. So you could have an open standard that people barely use. They use the extensions and develop on top of it, which is then not supported and non-standard by everything else, and doesn't validate and doesn't do all the rest of the other. So this is why we have leaders in technology that go, you know what, this sounds sounds too hard. I'm just gonna hand wave this and go with that big ERP system or whatever it might be. And instead of actually going, right, okay, technical due diligence, what should we use? What shouldn't we use? How should we use it? And do some tech spikes, trial it with customers, and then eventually move to actually something that's better than what we currently have. I like Ryan's comment that says that a standard, this is a FHIR standard, is so large you could run Quake on it. I definitely do anyway.
So Lucy's messaging me and saying, why is my question not getting answered?
Yeah.
So,
because Lucy, if you've been listening earlier, we already discussed this. I'm joking. Andy, do you want to answer that one?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm really qualified for that one, to be fair. I mean, assume you mean intellectual property rights with IPR there. I mean, you're not giving it away. I think that's probably the one thing it's worth being clear about with open source. You still own it. You're just you're licensing it to people. So it's not quite the same as public domain. However, there's nothing to stop people stealing it or using it without your knowledge.
That's a bit about the crown jewels before, and that's the argument. The counter argument I had a lot is, well, what if somebody just takes all that code? Understanding and trying to explain how that works is complicated. The other thing about IPR is if you are an agency or a consultancy and you're working for a customer on a time and materials basis, they own the IPR to that code. So you might not be able to open source it. You'd have to have explicit permission. Then you have the complexity of if you're using an open source project yourself and you decide to fork it and you do work on it for that customer would then have to approve you to do the pull request back into the main repository, which is obviously less than ideal, but completely achievable. And guess what? The first time you go through the pain and do that, the customer will probably see the benefits, and then it's not a problem again. You can have, the contracts and legal setup.
I think there's also that thing about when it stops, how things change and when does it become kind of IPR become applicable? Because if you're just using it and running it without any changes, that's one thing. But again, it's those improvements and pushing that back in that is, a key differentiator between like the IPR kind of approvals, and also again how it's been tended. So some of those like government framework contracts mandate a load of stuff in terms of IPR ownership, which kind of doesn't really care or doesn't make any reference to if you're using open standards, because they're the same stuff that's used for any kind of intellectual property stuff, any consulting service. So it's not really written for software engineering as a specific set of service. It's just like a general contract. And I think you probably, we've had a lot of conversations, I've had a lot of conversations wherever I've worked about how all of those things need to kind of come together to make sure that it's kind of de-risked and everybody understands what's being used, how it's being used, and who owns what. And I think having that conversation at the start rather than at the end where you have to do that push back into the repository where everyone's like, hang on a minute, what? Or by the way, we used all these open source components, the client's just not aware of it. I think those conversations kind of up front.
Those crazy agiles, with the let's just use this because we decided on this sprint. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be one that Marcus is aware of, who's listening, a kind of recent thing where someone made a responsible disclosure on something that was kind of online, and the company, who's a community interest company, bizarrely, has issued some fairly significant letters and threatening all sorts of stuff around recommendation of deletion and confirmation around all those things. So it does, again, those things around responsible disclosures and open source stuff around stuff being there seems to be biting people in the arse more than it really should be around people just kind of trying to do the right thing.
So that was actually a really good question, Lucy. Sorry that I missed it. Have we got any other questions that anyone can see? That's
Chimbo Sonic raised the question at 6:18 quite a while ago now.
6:18,
which I think is worth talking about. How do you help and remunerate those devs that give you tools for free and maintain for free? I think it's a great question, actually. I certainly, when I first heard of the open source as an idea, the idea always seemed to be to me that the idea is it was a collective thing. So if you used open source, you would feel obliged to contribute something else to the open source community. That doesn't seem to work very well in practice. I don't think there seems to be there's a lot more give than take in open source, definitely. However, there's also financial remuneration as well. A lot of people, companies have Patreons and things like that you can support, or they have proper financial backing with commercial organizations that you can offer support and things like that.
There's the simple things. Sorry, Andy. I was going to say there's the simple things like buy me a coffee or buy me a beer link that you can stick on the README. But to be honest, Chimbo Sonic, when I find out I'll get any help or remuneration, I will let you know.
I think there's also some basic stuff which doesn't really pay the rent, but I think that contribution to those sorts of things does help people in job interviews, particularly where you're able to submit that as part of what you do and showing a level of contribution as well. So it's not great and it shouldn't be expected of people, but if those things already exist, I think it's a good way to kind of demonstrate your thought processes and how your coding works and those sorts of things. Because we did a previous episode on like hiring practices and how sometimes it's mean just to give someone an hour to say, show me how you would work on this. I think that's another good way of demonstrating, how you work and I guess the quality of some of the work that you produce, which I think could help people in getting other jobs. But I don't think it should be necessary, but I think it's helpful.
It is helpful. I mean, sometimes people will say they feel at disadvantage because they've not had the opportunity in past employments or whatever to be able to open source stuff. So it is kind of nice. Now, if I'm interviewing someone, I will do a cheeky sort of search around, see what they might have worked on and contributed to, but it isn't a huge factor. And if someone doesn't have that, it's not counted against them, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a useful shortcut. It can save a bit of time. You can see some code that person's written. Sometimes, though, they don't want that code to be seen. Though I've written there's some stuff on my GitHub that I probably should take down because I'll never get a job again if people look at it.
That's the one thing I've learned from this episode is go back to GitHub after this and just have a quick look and see what some of the comments are. Is this even maintained anymore?
But yeah, the same thing. I would never say no to someone because they didn't do open source contributions. But certainly, having see some open source contributions, you just get what sort of things they write. It just helps you. It's a bit of a shortcut to knowing whether the person's any good or not.
I have actually had somebody when I did a number of sort of Cordova open source plugins, which was the right thing to do at the time, was open source them because you're probably only implementing a small amount and people add extra bits back to it. Had somebody who I won't name the name of basically clone the entire repo, not fork, and just change the license agreement and the name on it and publish it as their own so that they could help win work for their consultancy. So they did change it so that my name was added to the bottom next to their name after I kind of mentioned that it was maybe not the right thing to do. But there are practices like that as well. So you've still got to do your due diligence and check, did that person really write that and are they who they say they are?
Kind of them.
Yeah, I was very pleased with the result, actually.
Look at you.
To be honest, now I think, I wish that I'd have just let them take ownership of it. But anyway,
another one essay from Ryan around public sector application code.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, GDS specify that if you create a new public service, it must be open source or coded in the open for other people to look at. And every project, pretty much, maybe bar one that I've worked on or overseen in the past probably couple of years, have been coded in the open. How discoverable that is another matter, to Lauren's earlier point. But if you are creating a GDS service and you're going through discovery, alpha and beta, there are very, very strict requirements around being able to pass and push those services into alpha, beta, and live. And one of them is that you must code in the open or have a good reason not to. I can never actually think of a good reason why a public service should not be coded in the open. I mean, if someone has a very good reason, I would love to hear it, but I can't think of one. So I would love to see anybody that's passed the GDS assessment of a service that's a new service recently that's passed that isn't coded in the open and why they passed.
It's an interesting one because there was all that controversy around the COVID tracking app because that was all promised to be published in the open, and it took a really long time for that actually to kind of turn up and for people then to be able to spot some issues in it. And I think that did add to it, and people were able to sort of contribute and change stuff. But again, it was one of those things that was live and everybody was like, is it coming? Where's the GitHub repo? Like, when are we going to start to see some of this? Because it was so high profile, there was so many eyes on it that I think it did help to get some of those things ironed out quite quickly, and for people to actually understand what it was.
So what you should do is open source it right from the start. Otherwise you have that, I don't want to show you yet, I'm a bit worried. And you know what? There was reasons why they were worried about open sourcing it, which then became obvious. And in fact, they looked a little bit silly for it. So I remember there was a little bit in the code where it says, this is a hack around local notifications to try and keep the Zigbee alive that does this. It's like, if you're doing that and you're ashamed of it, or you think that you probably shouldn't be doing it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it, never mind open sourcing the code. So I think there's potentially other reasons why things don't get open source. But if you do it from day one, it keeps you honest. It's a public service. you're paid, via public money to produce that service. If the rules say code it open from day one, or do a different job.
Yeah, there was definitely some code annotations in that, which was very much a internal comments only, when you're kind of reading through it and thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure you ever thought that maybe a couple of 100,000 people might be able to have a look at this. Yeah, and I think that shows around, I think, some of the naivety around what some of the people who were probably developing that thought would be on it, and the level of scrutiny, because we're all sitting there waiting, going, go on, show us what you've been doing, show we've been doing for this past few months.
Ryan's followed up and said it stopped people putting keys into Git. Fortunately, it didn't. I'm still seeing that happen.
That's what that part of what that responsible disclosure was about keys in Git.
Yeah.
So it didn't. Sadly.
No, I mean, there are automated checks and pre-commit hooks and things that you can have to prevent that from happening. Even GitHub itself has scanning for things like credentials, but I've seen credentials in Word documents pushed to Git and all this crazy nonsense like that, or in images and things. So there's only
how open source do these things have to be? I mean, can you get away with send us a self-addressed stamped envelope and we'll print out the code and send it to you? Is that enough?
Well, so they say it has to be coded in the open. It doesn't mean that the code needs to be made open source in the future or mailed to somebody. For me, coded in the open is a very specific, we will be pushing our commits to a public repository. I mean, that's just my correct interpretation of the rule.
that's certainly how it's intended to be.
Yeah. It's just not in the spirit of the open source what the other people are doing, right?
Someone sends me the paper and the ink and a printer and a courier to come and collect it. I'll print out some source code and send it to you every day if you want.
Yeah, minified and or transpiled or something as well, and it's 0.0 font.
No, it does make me think about all my awful teenage bands that I was in, and I was convinced I was doing copyright by sending myself the kind of lyrics and the note music in the post, and then putting a sticker on the back so if anybody did ever steal my what were absolutely atrocious songs, I could kind of wave a second a second class envelope from like 1998 and say I wrote it first. But yeah, that's obviously not what we're talking about, but it's very reminiscent of the ways that I would have inured myself against any copyright theft of my
I don't know, but I want to go and find these envelopes and open them. One, because it'll be funny to open them because then they're not copyright anymore, but also to read what was in them. These magical lyrics.
The problem with lockdown is my dad has actually found that in the attic and is threatening on it. So I'm glad that he doesn't really understand how computers work that well, because otherwise I would be in a lot of danger.
We can fix that.
Please don't. I'm not sure we've got any more questions now. So I'll give it a couple of minutes. We'll say a couple of seconds for people to get any more sort of final questions they've got in. But I think our next one of these is going to be in a fortnight's time. So same time, same place. Yeah, 2 weeks. Next week. Keep talking about next week, but we mean next week.
That was the hand movement. That was the hand movement I was talking earlier. You have to do that when you say next.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago. So it would be lovely, again, if we were to see you, and also if there's any things that you want to hear our inane burblings about, we'd be more than happy to comply. And we're on Twitter, so feeling_techish. And yeah, just let us know what you thought on there. Obviously, I shall not be sharing anything about my sort of teenage angst on there. And yeah, the plan is at the moment to do things live from here on out. Lee's denying it's got anything to do with the editing backlog, so we're gonna do that.
One day there will be a Twitter campaign to release the lost episodes.
I will edit them now that I've got all my time back.
Release the Crosley cut.
I can't remember what they're on now, to be honest. Maybe we'll just pretend that they're live. I don't know. Is everything live from now on? Yes. if you think this wasn't too bad.
Yeah,
I guess that even though we've only had about 10 or 12 viewers at various different points, I think that we'll still be pushing out the podcast to the regular old channels, so you can still listen in the old-fashioned way of offline and audio only, so you don't need to see our ugly mugs.
Yeah, and just a little reminder at the end around a disclaimer. So it's our personal views, not of any current or former employers, friends, family, or pets. So that, yeah, please don't sue us, is what we're saying, that these are all our intensely personal opinions, and nobody's endorsed us in saying these things. So we're just kind of saying what we think and feel.
I don't even endorse my own views or believe in my own views half the time, and it changes throughout the episode. So that's...
It's open source, push to commit.
Yeah.
You can just change it whenever you want.
Yeah.
Right, pushing to master. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.